Hello YouTube. Coming back with another video showcasing my vinyl collection. This video is going to cover everything I own sort of in the indie slash alternative arena. And, I think compared to a lot of the other videos I've made, which have been more centered on very specific subgenres like punk and hardcore and post-hardcore and new wave, this one's going to span a lot more, or a lot broader of a spectrum of different styles of music and different styles of playing within these different artists and groups that I'm going to be showcasing here, because alternative rock and indie rock over the years is a pretty broad general term. It has a lot more to do with the social class of the band, or its sort of public draw, as it does the actual music that they're playing. So we'll be looking at a lot of different kinds of things here. And a lot of this is kind of more into the classic 80s college rock, sort of before indie rock became appropriated in the digital age. And okay, so starting off, show Heaven Up Here by Echo and the Bunnymen. This came out in 1981 on Sire Records. I purchased this at Fingerprints in Long Beach, California. I highly suggest going to that store if you're ever down in the Southern California region. Fingerprints is a very cool, very small record store that also sells a lot of CDs if you're still buying those, and they sell them at very cheap prices now, as well as DVDs. They have a coffee shop. It's very well-rounded kind of artsy sort of place, and they have like concerts there and whatever. But I found this there, as well as that Cure record that I showed in my last collection. And this is one of their earlier releases. It doesn't have any of their really well-known songs like Killing Moon or Lips Like Sugar or anything like that, but this is still a pretty great record. If you don't know anything about this band, they kind of came sort of in the middle of the new wave, the British sort of new wave thing, but and post-punk thing, and they kind of lived in that sort of Smiths-ish world where they got along with sort of the new wave crowd and the kind of the goth crowd, but they also played sort of this jangly style of psychedelic rock as well, and the Doors being one of their biggest influences. Also sort of in that world, although probably not considered as such anymore, U2's first record, Boy. And this is a band that has a lot of loaded expectations attached to them now, having become one of the biggest bands in the world. They still sell out arenas today, but when they first started out, they were just a small, unassuming indie new wave group from Ireland that played in a similar kind of jangly post-punk fashion. And this record, I think has an appeal that might exist outside of that usual sort of adult contemporary U2 audience that they have now. And if you're into alternative rock, or you're into sort of indie or whatever, and you think you're too cool for school for U2, go back and listen to their first 3 records. And this one even has a little bit of a gothy appeal as well on a few tracks. No introduction really needed for this band. This is R.E.M's first album, Murmur, which I believe came out in '83 on IRS Records. This is an original 80s pressing of it, not a too recent of a re-release. And this album is great. This is, I think, the definition of sort of 80s college rock. Definitely sort of one of those bands that I think defined an era and defined a musical style, especially in America, and would be one of those kind of flagship bands that led up to the alternative rock thing happening in the 90s. And this album in particular, Murmur, a lot like U2, they weren't quite as strong of songwriters yet. They didn't have their aspirations for the arenas, so it comes off a little bit more jangly and lo-fi and has a different kind of personality. Here we have R.E.M's second record, Reckoning, and also released on IRS when they were still an indie band. Very similar to Murmur in a lot of ways. I don't think as strong of an album, not as many standout tracks, but it's still carrying on what they were about. That kind of Athens, Georgia jangle pop style that they were playing back when Michael Stipe still had hair, and a lot of it, and it was usually in his face. You could barely understand a single thing he was saying or singing. Good album, though. And maybe one of my favorite R.E.M. records, at least second to Automatic for the People, is their 1987 classic album, Document, which has quite a few recognizable songs on here. I think some of their first bigger hits, like The One I Love and End of the World as We Know It, one of the great rock and roll sing-alongs. And this came out around the same time as U2 released the Joshua Tree, and I think that one was kind of seen as like the UK version of the great alternative rock album of that year, and this one was kind of seen as sort of the US accompaniment of that forward-looking style of music. And the production on this album is quite a bit more crisp and clean than their previous records before it. It has a bigger kind of rock sound. They were kind of getting ready for the arena in this one. And it has a bright kind of... it still sounds like R.E.M. and everything, and it's still kind of playing in that sort of, shy indie rock style, but I think that it has a bolder kind of voice on this album. And still one of, I think, like I said before, I think it's only second to Automatic for the People as being one of their best records. Here we have an EP by a lesser-known sort of R.E.M. contemporary, camper band Beethoven, a California band. This was a kind of a promotional EP that was released before their first album, Telephone Free Landslide Victory. This is the Take the Skinheads Bowling EP, and it has Take the Skinheads Bowling, as well as a few of the instrumental tracks from that album. And this was released on Rough Trade in the UK. And, I don't know how to if you've never listened to them before, they're a very underrated group. They released quite like 4 or 5 albums in the 80s, and they have a very kind of catchy, sort of jangly indie college rock 80s kind of sound, but they also were playing a lot in ska and Latin music, and bringing in a lot of different sort of influences in what they were doing. And I think in a way really kind of revolutionary. A lot of strings, violins, horns, but they had kind of a bratty sort of punk rock thing going on as well, sort of like the Violent Femmes. And in a lot of ways, I think we're kind of a precursor to that sort of Pavement style. You listen to this, the way the singer sort of has that kind of lackadaisical, maybe sort of Lou Reed-ish delivery of his vocals, and it reminds me a lot of what Stephen Malkmus would do later with Pavement. And of course, the lead singer would go on to start the alternative rock band in the 90s, Cracker, I think that's what they were called. Speaking of the Violent Femmes, here's their third record, just called 3. And this came out, I think, 88 on Slash Records. And, the Violent Femmes, they're one of those bands that everybody, I guess, likes, or a lot of people sort of know who they are and what they do. Blister on the Sun is kind of their one song that everybody knows, but a lot of people don't really look into them further than that, and they really should, because they're one of the most consistent bands out there. Every album they ever put out is really good and has at least 5 or 6 great standout tracks that you can sing along to. They were Gordon Gano, the lead singer of the band, not only had one of the great sort of like snotty punk rock singing voices, but he also was a great songwriter, and he had a lot of influences, you know, not only just from punk, but also from gospel and blues and bluegrass, and it all kind of mixed in there in a really interesting way. And I think they're one of the most influential bands, both on alternative rock and indie rock, still to this day. And they just got back together and released an album, and they're going to be doing a tour, and I hope to see them this summer. Okay, moving up the timeline a little bit, we have Sugar's, I want to say second release or third release file under Easy Listening. This is the band that Bob Mould started after Husker Du broke up, and kind of a different sort of trajectory. I mean, if you've been listening to Husker Du's music up to this point, you see that they're going more in a college rock, indie rock style, playing less hardcore and a little bit more kind of a singy sort of melodic style. And Sugar was sort of the full realization of that, kind of playing in more of a power pop, guitar-oriented style. A lot of it, especially their first album, which I think is quite a bit better than this one, but their first album, Copper Blue, if you happen to take a listen to that, sure sounds a lot like what the Foo Fighters would do a few years later. And I think even Dave Grohl would be the first to admit that. A little bit more on the experimental side. This is one of the last records I've recently bought. Found it at Amoeba in Hollywood. This is the Butthole Surfers, Psychic, Powerless, and Another Man's Sack. Butthole Surfers being the infamous Texas-based noise rock band. You know, when they first started, they were around for quite a bit, and their style changed quite a bit through that. Eventually, they had a few hits in the 90s, and they sort of mellowed. But if you go back to their first 3 or 4 records that they released in the 80s, this is pretty radical, experimental, not song oriented at all. A little bit more, like I said, some noise music in a lot of ways. There's a little bit of kind of a post-punk thing going on there as well. Definitely very influenced by sort of the rough trade bands of the late 70s. But there's also kind of a no-wave kind of sense of, you know, pure psych freak out kind of stuff. One of the most original bands in alternative rock, and not a band for everybody, especially at this point in their career. Okay, and here we have an album by the Olympia-based band Dub Narcotic Soundsystem, Bone Dry Bass Hump Super Ball Rot Gut. That is a mouthful. This was a band that Calvin Johnson, the main leader of all of those Olympia-based K Records bands, that was his label. This was the band he started after the maybe slightly better known indie rock outfit Beat Happening, which is a bit more of sort of a Velvet Underground sort of jangly indie thing. This was a bit more of a dance rock kind of thing, a lot more sort of beat oriented and song oriented, and this was his band that he did, I think, through most of the 90s. I found this at Atomic Records in North Hollywood, and it's pretty good. I tend to like Beat Happening a little bit more. I think it's a little clearer of a vision, but if I understand that band's not for everybody, but I would say that people who maybe don't like Beat Happening might like this band better. Also on K Records, we have the Makeup's album Sound Verite. This is a kind of an interesting group. This is the band started by Ian Svevenius, I believe I'm saying that name right, of the Washington, D.C. post-hardcore band Nations of Ulysses, which are kind of a more sort of spazzy, jazzy take on sort of the Fugazi thing. This was his second group that he did sort of around the same time that Calvin Johnson was starting Dub Narcotic. And these guys had this kind of like lounge jazz slash James Brown soul kind of thing going on, mixed with sort of a post-hardcore punk kind of thing. They're very original, very interesting kind of band, that released quite a few records and singles in the 90s, maybe underneath the radar of what was going on, but it has a very cool kind of like 60s sort of vibe to it. Also on K Records, I'm noticing that all of these albums unintentionally were on the same label. The K Records, I should say, Olympia, Washington based, one of the main indie labels of the 80s and 90s, still going today, although not quite as popular as it once was, and there's not quite as many acts coming out of it, but a lot of different kind of subgenres came out of it, and it was a very important label in the early Northwest scene, and one of the most important bands to come out of it, or one of the most important songwriters to come out of it, was Phil Elverum's The Microphones, and this is The Glow Part 2. This is a 2-album set. I actually bought this at a show that he was playing in Salt Lake City at a small kind of backyard club there called Kilby Court. If you happen to ever be in Salt Lake, check out shows there. They're very, very small, very intimate. It's kind of a makeshift yard / shed that they turned into a music venue. And a lot of kind of lesser known and maybe obscure indie groups would play through there a lot. The Microphones is kind of a lo-fi indie folk kind of thing. He later went on to do the band Mount Eerie, which maybe I think some people know a little bit better. He also produced a lot of records for K, as well as played drums on a few others. So he was a big part of what was going on in Olympia, Washington. I guess probably still is. I haven't really been keeping up with him. Like I said, this is a 2-album set. There's a lot of music on here, and it is very, very lo-fi in the sense that it's all kind of 4-track recorded, in a bedroom, kind of just him and a guitar kind of stuff. But he was, very prolific songwriter and musician. We have the Seven Skies H3 album by the Flaming Lips, released on Warner Brothers only a couple years ago. I want to say this kind of like 2013. This was released on Record Store Day, and I believe it's about to be Record Store Day again. That is reflecting the hell out of my microphone. The Flaming Lips have been kind of doing some weird stuff lately. I think the last album of theirs that I really liked was At War with the Mystics, which had at least half the track listing was pretty good and pretty singable, and then ever since then they've with Embryonic and the album that followed, and then this, which I think was sort of some odds and ends off of Embryonic or the next album, or maybe somewhere in between. A lot more kind of just strange psych noise, freak out kind of stuff, which is cool. I'm glad that they're making the music they want to do and they don't really care about who they may alienate. That's very punk rock of them at this point in their career, having all of them entering their 50s now. But it's not incredibly listenable. It's not bad. I took a listen to this, and I guess I sort of enjoyed it. A lot of sort of soundscapes. I don't know. None of it really sounds like it's a full, complete thought, though, musically speaking. I guess I'm glad I got this as a Record Store Day exclusive. But it's I don't know. I kind of appreciate them when they're kind of playing more sort of just fuzzed out guitar, psych pop. All right, here's a band called Skinyard. This is a 1993 album of theirs. Called Inside the Eye. I bought this at Burger Records in Fullerton, California. If you happen to be in the Southern California area, you should check that place out too. One, because they it's a cool record shop. It has pretty good deals and a really big, extensive indie and punk rock collection there, but also because Burger Records doubles as a record label for a lot of interesting and cool sort of noise and indie groups in the Southern California area and beyond. They're kind of becoming a little bit of an empire now, and it's run by a couple of 24-year-old hippie latchkey kids who run the store as well. But I bought this album because Skinyard was one of the early grunge bands, kind of the pre-Nirvana era. And Jack Endino was their, I believe, their guitar player in the band. Yes. And he also produced a lot of albums for Sub Pop Records, including Nirvana's Bleach. But this is a little later in their career. I think, grunge had really kind of exploded and is sweeping the nation, as it were. And I think they wanted to jump on that a little bit. And this is a slightly more commercial sounding record than their earlier work. I think their stuff from the 80s, from the Deep Six compilation up through maybe this album, is a little bit more my speed, a little bit noisier, a little bit more kind of experimental, and a little bit more garagey. This sounds a lot like, I don't know, kind of generic 90s post-grunge. Like, it sounds a little bit like later Soul Asylum, or like early Collective Soul, or whatever, like that kind of stuff, but maybe a slightly tinge dirtier. Yeah, I'm not mad that I bought it, but it's not my favorite record. We'll just say that. It's okay. Okay, I bought this at Amoeba. This is the Red Hot Chili Peppers' Freaky Styley. I believe this came out in 86. This was their second full-length album, produced by George Clinton of the Parliament Funkadelic. And so this album, even more so than a lot of their albums, has more of a funk influence. It's a very colorful animated cover here, and picture of everybody who was in the band at the time, including their original guitar player, Hillel Slovak. And yeah, this is very funky, very almost, in some tracks kind of disco-y, dancey sort of album, and less punk than their first album, and less metal than Mother's Milk, and less rap than Blood Sugar Sex Magic. But there's elements of all of that in there. But yeah, the George Clinton influence is very strong on this album. But I think it's actually one of their better albums of the 80s. And they're another band that's gone through a big evolution of style, and now they're playing pretty much straight up guitar-oriented classic rock sound now. But if you go back here, they were a little bit more kind of a niche, interesting, strange-sounding group. This is, I think, a somewhat recent pressing. Boy, that light from my microphone is sure bright. I might do something about that on my next video. This is Paul's Boutique by the Beastie Boys. Maybe not alternative rock exactly, but in a way I do kind of consider them that, even though they're sort of playing in a hip-hop form. I think they're so experimental, and they're so creative, and they're doing so many things with both electronics and sampling and live instrumentation. Of course, they were originally a hardcore band that just started playing hip-hop, and I think there's always been a punk element to what they do, sort of in their style or their vocal delivery, or certainly Sabotage is pretty much a straight up punk song, as far as I'm considered. But this album, this was their second album, their follow-up to License to Ill, which was a little bit more of a straightforward kind of Run DMC style hip-hop album. This really pushed sampling in advanced ways. I would say there would be no Girl Talk today, or a lot of those mashup artists or whatever, if there was never a Paul's Boutique. It really is kind of a groundbreaking record as far as its production goes. Lyrically too, the band is better, I think, than they were on License to Ill. They're exploring different things. They're bringing in lots of kind of they're like their cultural sort of Jewish perspective to things, which is interesting for hip hop. But yeah, this album is kind of a masterpiece, and maybe not my favorite of the bands, but I think it's a landmark of recording American popular music. Very influential 90s group. Portishead came out of Bristol, England in the mid-90s. They were a big part of the trip-hop scene, along with Massive Attack and Tricky, and a few other groups. These guys, I don't know, what do you say about them? They're very kind of jazzy in a lot of ways, and their singer, Beth Gibbons, had this very kind of smoky, vocal fry kind of voice, but also very mournful and very tuneful when she wanted to be, and she had actually very, very distinct range and could sing a lot of different things, a lot of emotion, and they're very, I think more so than any of the other trip-hop groups, a lot more kind of introspective, lyrical perspective. This album was their second album after Dummy. I think this came out in 97 and 98. And this one's quite a bit darker, and the beats on it are a lot heavier, and I think that, there's kind of a bit more of a sinister edge to this album than there is on Dummy, which is a lot more confessional. But both are very good in their own ways. The song Cowboys, check that one out. Okay, and this definitely a newer group. Although they'd broken up and just recently announced that they were getting back together. LCD Soundsystem's self-titled debut has a popular song, Daft Punk is Playing at My House. I've heard that on a lot of commercials and that kind of stuff. This came out in 2005. Kind of a dance electro-punk group, sort of in the mid-2000s when there was that sort of new wave revival stuff. There was a lot of groups that were coming out that sounded a lot like different new wave bands from the 80s. Most specifically, I think this band took a lot of inspiration from the Talking Heads, sort of that speaking in tongues era Talking Head stuff. A lot of synths, a lot of drum, different kind of drum beats going on simultaneously. Songs that really build and build and build on these big instrumental passages, and less lyrically focused, but a lot of fun kind of dancey guitar stuff as well. And I think of all of those bands from that era, that were kind of just aping a lot of new wave, I think this was one of the better bands to do it, and I think that. I can't think of his name right now, but the lead singer-songwriter was one of the better songwriters to come from that era as well. So I'm glad that they got back together. I saw them play, having not known a whole lot about their music, I saw them play the Sasquatch Music Festival on the main stage, and I kind of thought, I want to keep my spot. I want to, whatever band it was that's playing after them, I've forgotten now, but they were the band that I kind of was more excited about, having not known too much about this band. And I said, well, I'll sit through their set so I can keep my spot. And then these guys ended up blowing, as far as I was concerned, everybody at that festival out of the water. They just put on one of the best shows. And at that point in the day, I was exhausted. I was kind of just ready to see the last band that I wanted to see and go back to my tent or whatever. But I remember these guys turned the entire place into a party. Incredible live band. Okay, and lastly, I wasn't quite sure where to show them. They're another one of those miscellaneous groups. I guess if I collected more metal, I would show it with that, but I don't. I'm going to take it out of the plastic so it doesn't have as much lens flare. And this has a matte cardboard finish. This is a collaboration album between the bands Sunn, Sunn, and Ulver, called Terrestrials. This came out a few years ago. One of their last releases, or more later releases, I should say. It's released on Southern Lord, and just 3 tracks, but they're quite long. I don't know exactly how to describe this music. It's very soundscapey. Sunn is sort of known as, very very experimental drone metal group. They play very heavy music, very loud music, but very few. Not a ripping kind of thrashy heavy metal band with lots of lead breaks or anything like that. They often play very spaced out sort of reverb heavy music with these droning guitars, wall to wall guitar sound that kind of goes on very 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 slowly at a glacial pace, and so their music becomes very overwhelming, and almost sort of post-rock in a way, but even more kind of pushing the edges of soundscape experimentalism even further than that. Ulver, the band that they're playing with, came out of the whole Norwegian black metal thing, and as they went on, they became more experimental and a bit more electronic. And since Sunn has a little bit of a black metal influence as well, it makes sense that the two groups would cross over at a point. I can't say this is music that you might always want to listen to, but if you like sort of headphones music, as I call it, stuff that you just kind of space out to, or you just kind of put on big sound canceling headphones and lay on your bed and sort of take it all in, this is one of those bands to do it with. They'll definitely put you in a different world, both Sunn and Ulver. And I've been slowly getting more and more into this band and this style of music. And that's everything I have to show here. If you have anything you want to comment on any of these records or any information you want to add, you can do so in the comments section. Also, go back and watch my other videos dealing with the rest of my record collection or my movie collection. I'm going to try and get back to doing movie-related videos sooner as well. Thank you.